Now it is my honor to introduce in a virtual way our preacher for this morning. Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey is a professor at Drake University and an author and an activist. She's written the book Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation, which many of us here at Lyndale have read. She's also written a book on parenting white kids to be anti-racist kids, and she's working on a forthcoming book. And she is also a friend of Lyndale. She is a longtime co-conspirator and sacred troublemaker with many of us here at Lyndale. And so we are deeply, deeply grateful to welcome Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey.
Thank you so much, beautiful Reverend Rebecca Volkel. Lyndale, it's so wonderful to be with you. I'm just blessed to be here today, even though I'm here. So Lent, it's kind of a little bit of a dour time, isn't it, for some of us? We give stuff up, discipline ourselves. We, during the season of Lent, change our relationship to things, food, social media maybe, spending, whatever it is we decide to stop doing for 40 days. And some of this giving up seems to suggest perhaps that some of those things are kind of bad or illicit somehow. So we're giving them up. And also, sometimes with Lent, there's this sense that like, it's going to kind of suck, this giving up. So I was raised deep in the church, but I actually didn't know what Lent was until seminary. Most Baptists don't really do Lent. And that's what I was raised in the Baptist church. I literally didn't know what Lent was until I went to graduate school in theological education. But when I first learned about Lent, I thought, how cool. That sounds really hard. You see, for Baptists, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. With our emphasis on sin and human failings, cool and hard are often totally tangled up together for Baptists. Like, cool, here's something we can do to make it even more clear that there's something wrong with our bodies, or make it more clear that pleasure is suspect. You see, I grew up not even allowed to play cards on Sundays or dance on any day of the week. So forgoing pleasure as a way to mark a holy season, that way of thinking about Lent, that resonated with me. Give stuff up? Yep, appropriate given the measly creature that I am. Okay, so I set down that kind of theology a very long time ago. And I imagine this community of Lyndale doesn't do Lent quite that way. I imagine that you all, like me, have a frame that seeks to embrace the goodness and the delight and the joy that comes from and with embodiment, that lifts up our innate belovedness as creatures made in the image of the divine. But even though I gave up my Baptist-esque theology a long time ago, I have to confess that it sneaks back in every now and then. And one of the places it's most likely to do that is when it comes to walking the path of justice. So I know that Lyndale believes, like I do, that we're called to do justice by the gospel. In fact, that's what this whole Easter story is about. It's about this community of people living out a vision of belovedness and just relations so utterly that one of them, Jesus, ends up executed. That's right. A movement bearing witness to belovedness and justice is in such compelling ways that the powers that be had to try and stop it. I also know, as a justice-seeking community, that you all have been walking with a question. What is the spiritual work we need to do around repair and reparations? What are the spiritual practices that might help mitigate against hoarding, against the pervasive cultural collective tendencies in our society to buy more? And so, oh my goodness, I cut out a line of my sermon, excuse me, to buy more, hold on to more, keep something for me and mine. We're immersed in these kinds of collective practices. And so as I thought about these powerful, beautiful questions that you all are walking with during Lent, Lindale, I thought maybe we should step back and ask about the framework we use to take up these kinds of questions about the spiritual work we do around repair, questions around what spiritual practices mitigate against something like hoarding. As in, what if we asked, what are the emotional and spiritual postures we take as we think about those questions? And that's why we read about Lazy and Puba this morning. So the story we heard just a minute ago comes from this strange and beautiful little book called The River House Stories. And it's a book of short stories about two women who are friends and lovers, and they're very strange and wonderful women. And they live on a riverboat in Oregon. And one of them is a construction worker and electrician. And the other one's a writer who spends her day writing and talking to ducks. The River House Stories is kind of a sacred text for me. I'm going to hold it up for you. This is how dog-eared my copy of it is. Someone gave this book to me not long after I came out as a lesbian. And even though that was a long time ago, I can still feel in my body what coming out was like. It was like completely liberating and life-giving, but it was also breathtakingly terrifying. At the time that I came out, I was married to a man. I was already a pastor, and it was in a welcoming church, but still. And I'd grown up in a conservative Christian family, and that's still who my family was. And so as I walked that really difficult journey, the River House Stories, it became for me almost like healthy comfort food. It was like part bedtime story, part fantasy fairy tale about how full of love and joy and the ability to talk to ducks the world could be, of what kind of possibilities were actually worth the kind of loss that I was facing, the things I was giving up in that season of my life. So I'm going to read part of what we read to you again. Lazy loved Puba and loved loving her. Out past the edge of the world's agreements, beyond her own approval, the rules of her childhood, beyond even her own mind. She loved her and loved loving her, and the loving brought forth in her all of her courage, as well as all of her limitations, all of her desires to be like others, to melt in, to be invisible. Past the edges of the world's agreements. When I was coming out, I was choosing to take a step past the edge of the world's agreements about what was normal. And you know what? Those agreements hold all of our lives in so many ways. They create the systems in which our lives are lived, the structures and expectations that hold our society together at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. Histories and legacies and ways of being that brought us and sustain to this day realities like white supremacy, colonial settler realities, extractive capitalism. All of those things are world's agreements. All the stuff, the hard stuff that a yearning to walk the way of justice and repair presents to us as US American Christians, as white Christians, as economically secure Christians, all the stuff we have to face if we are those things. Now, hoarding, or the ability to hoard, is an actual material product of those systems. It's the fruit of them, the material stuff we get, and can keep because of those agreements. But hoarding's more than that too. It's also an emotional and a spiritual response to living lives embedded in those systems. It's an individualistic, I'm on my own, these things matter more than do the relationships I might get to have and the ways of knowing and being in the world that might come if I risked surrendering my stuff. So here we are, friends, on Palm Sunday, and you all are daring to wonder, what are the spiritual practices that can mitigate against that? What enables those of us yearning to respond to the call of the gospel, even if we don't always know how to do it, to redistribute when we are over-resourced and living unjust enrichments, to surrender some of the security that comes when we live, if we live completely and compliantly, for those of us who can, within the world's agreements. What are the spiritual practices that allow us to grow the mind, the body, and the ways of being that break from and are disloyal to the agreements that keep us bound up in injustice? And it's right at that point that we begin to walk with that beautiful, terrifying question that I want us to get clear about our posture. Should it be a posture of muscling up against ourselves and, sort of like my Baptist legacies tempt me to do, getting theologically excited about deprivation, about telling myself how depraved I am for having been part of these systems that I was born into for so very long? With the entirety of my being, I want to say, I don't think so. Nope. I don't believe that's the posture we're called to take. Whether or not you're queer, when you read the River House stories, you are left with no illusion about the truth that choosing to live life beyond the edge of the world's agreements, even then that means you give some stuff up, it opens up the most delicious and wonderful possibilities of actual freedom, of authentic connection, of utter belonging that any of us could ever want. It enables versions of those things most of us can't even imagine from where we stand if we're bound by all those agreements. In fact, doing so, choosing to live life beyond the edge, actually brings freedom, connection, and belonging into our lives in ways that are otherwise literally impossible, not accessible when we're in coercive, individualistic agreements with systems of injustice. So what happens when two women live outside of those agreements and against the childhood rules and against their own individualized, internalized sense of what's standard and how we just do things? Well, as Lazy thought about it, doing that, it took her away from the automatic stream of pictures of what life should be and forced her to create her own version of what life could be. And to be clear, we only read one part of it, but if you read this book, which you should, it is full of community, ducks, creatures, neighbors, friends, all living on the river. When I stepped past the edge and came out, and I named myself no longer able or willing to go along with all kinds of agreements that had shaped my life to that point, that journey put me in a position of alienation from and disruption with so much what I'd known before as normal. So many longstanding relationships, so many versions of me that before I'd just been told and accepted as, well, this is who you are or need to be. Coming out made me disloyal to all of it. And that was hard. And it was really scary. But oh my gosh, the world of love and laughter, loud and affirming, of connection and unfettered joy that became a possibility. My experience of coming out was never one of deprivation and loss, even when it was hard and involved grief and when I had to give stuff up or lose relationships. It was always instead an experience into connection and belonging of a sort I could have never known otherwise. And once I experienced that, I was hooked. I was hooked. There's a powerful Lenten poem in here, my friends, about the spiritual work surrounding the journey of repair, and specifically about the practices that can mitigate against hoarding. There's a poem in here that can actually help us walk into surrender of what we have unjustly acquired. Because when those of us who are white, or those of us who are colonial settler peoples, or those of us who live lives and jobs and physical well-being bound up in the exploitations of capitalism, or those of us who are all of those things, when we start to walk the way of repair and justice, we become a little bit like Lazy and Pooba. And I'm telling you, a few days on the riverboat with them, and you're not even tempted to go back to the world's agreements. Now, that doesn't make any of this suddenly easy. Just like coming out, walking past the edge of racism and colonial settler realities, and so much more takes courage. There's no way around it. And just like coming out, I want us to know this morning, this Palm Sunday day, that courage grows and stays not from muscling our way through against ourselves, disciplining ourselves into a willingness to live with deprivation so we can walk a path of justice. No. Courage is fed and grown as we find ourselves newly and over time planted in an alternative experience of connection and belonging. The sorts of experiences when, as, and after we take the risk that comes walking with that path. And that is true whether we're walking through city gates and people are yelling Hosanna and waving palm leaves, or whether we're walking beyond that threshold and into a week where we already know that as good as those Hosannas feel today, that we won't get to Easter, to resurrection, to life, without also walking through Good Friday, which I never understood why we called it that. I still don't actually. Without also walking through the sometimes excruciating fear, betrayal, pain, grief at the foot of the cross, first and as part of that journey too. Lent is very complicated. It's complicated, and Holy Week is so very complicated. When I talk about love and connection on a riverboat, I'm not suggesting there's no hard. Just like Jesus and his community were, despite the palms waving at him today, embedded in systems that caused death. And just like they were pressed by powers that longed to keep those systems in place, being willing to life walk past the edge of the world's agreements requires us also to face that truth, to acknowledge we are living in death-dealing systems. What those systems have done to all of us is worth grieving, lamenting, and also costs will often always be exacted from those of us who dare break with the systems. That is truth. But beloveds, whether it's the momentary joy of palms waving, because it's real nonetheless, even if it's short-lived, or the full joy of what ends up happening when brave women go to a tomb a week from today to tend a body and find instead that life has actually triumphed over death, and that communion and community that they thought had been destroyed was still here and in a more real way than ever before. That kind of pleasure, connection, joy not only comes to us only when we make the choice to live beyond the edge of the world's agreements, but it comes to us. And the longer we dwell there with one another, Hosanna, the more that same pleasure, connection, and joy enables our ongoing divestment from those death-dealing systems. It's the most amazing feedback loop ever. So what do we need spiritually to walk the journey of justice and repair, to turn seriously to the work of redistributing resources we've acquired from unjust realities? We need community. Community is a practice that mitigates against hoarding in unjust ways. Community is a spiritual practice that allows us to know the kind of belovedness that we can know as we change our relationships to systems of white supremacy and colonial settler realities. And in that terrifying surrender, we experience in community something new. We actually create forms of connection and knowing that couldn't have existed before. I mean, listen to this. Lazy loved Puba and loved loving her. It took her away from the automatic streams of pictures. And out of this wonder, the laugh emerged again, soft at first, then deep and loud and affirming. Lazy loved loving her, loved holding her, loved holding one of life's originals in her arms. There's not a dour word in that paragraph. And so I want us to reject, or at least be suspicious, about journeys of justice and reparations that rest on a framework of dour discipline and hard-edged deprivation. And instead, I want us to ask and keep asking, what would it mean to nurture a spiritual practice that enabled us to experience the pleasure of a radically different form of community and belonging that comes because and as we walk a surrender to the call of repair? Let me say it a different way. As you, Lindale, continue to walk with your beautiful questions, will you do it from a place that doubles down on a kind of discipline rooted in a sense of how sinful and broken we are? Or can you do it from a place that seeks connection and knows that joyfully leaning into surrender, the surrender that reparations and repair does indeed ask of us, allows us to experience a totally different way of being, a totally unheard of experience of belonging that lays on the other side of the threshold? I'm going to pray for you what I'm asking you to continue to pray for me, that you will choose and I will choose, and we will keep choosing to live life beyond the edge of the world's agreements together, and in so doing, know what it is to laugh and to love and to belong. Hosanna.
Amen.